On October 30, 1947, 23 countries signed an agreement in Geneva. It was not especially ambitious. It did not create any international organization. It was, basically, a gentleman's pact to lower tariffs. It was called the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. GATT. Nobody celebrated much. GATT was a provisional substitute. What they really wanted to create was an international trade organization, far more ambitious, but the US Congress refused to ratify it. So the world was left with Plan B. That provisional Plan B lasted 47 years. During that time, average tariffs on industrial products fell from over 40% to less than 4%. World trade multiplied by 20. And what started as an agreement among 23 countries eventually transformed, in 1995, into the World Trade Organization, with 164 member countries. It is the story of how a temporary patch became the architecture of global trade. In the previous episodes we saw the theoretical debate between free trade and protectionism, and the real-world consequences of comparative advantage. Today we will see how, after World War II, governments tried to build a system of rules for international trade. They did it because they had learned a terrible lesson. In the 30s, during the Great Depression, countries had erected massive trade barriers to protect their economies. The result was that world trade collapsed and the Depression deepened. Many historians argue that the trade wars of the 30s contributed to the climate of hostility that led to World War II. After the war, the consensus was clear: never again. Rules had to be created to prevent it from happening again. GATT operated with a simple logic. Member countries sat down to negotiate tariff reductions in rounds. Each round lasted years. And the fundamental principle was the most favored nation clause: if you reduced a tariff for one member country, you had to reduce it for all other members equally. This eliminated discrimination. You could not give trade advantages to your allies and punish your rivals. The rules were the same for everyone. At least in theory. In practice, GATT had enormous limitations. It only covered industrial goods. Agricultural products and services were left out. It had no real mechanism to enforce the rules. If a country violated them, retaliation depended on the goodwill of others. And decisions were made by consensus. That meant a single country could block any progress. Even so, it worked. The 8 rounds of GATT negotiations, from the first in Geneva in 1947 to the Uruguay round that concluded in 1994, reduced tariffs dramatically. World trade grew at an unprecedented pace. Participating countries prospered. But as GATT grew, its limitations became more evident. Trade was no longer just ships loaded with steel and wheat. It was financial services, intellectual property, foreign investment, telecommunications. The world needed new rules. And a real mechanism to enforce them. On January 1, 1995, GATT ceased to exist as a provisional agreement and was transformed into the World Trade Organization. The WTO inherited all of GATT's rules but added 3 fundamental things. First, expand its scope. The WTO covered not only industrial goods but also services, intellectual property, and trade-related investment measures. Second, a dispute settlement mechanism with teeth. If a country believed another was violating the rules, it could file a complaint before a WTO panel. The panel issued a binding ruling. If the losing country did not comply, the winning country could impose authorized trade retaliation. Third, a permanent institutional structure, headquartered in Geneva, with its own secretariat and periodic ministerial conferences. The WTO was, in many respects, a triumph of multilateralism. For the first time in history, there was a system of global trade rules with real enforcement capacity. Small countries could take large ones before a tribunal and win. Costa Rica won a case against the United States. Antigua and Barbuda won one against the United States on the matter of online gambling. But the WTO also inherited deep tensions that would eventually erupt. On November 30, 1999, the WTO convened its 3rd ministerial conference in Seattle, Washington state. The goal was to launch a new round of negotiations. What happened was very different. More than 40,000 protesters took to the streets of Seattle. Environmentalists, unionists, developing country activists, anarchists. Police responded with tear gas and water cannons. The images went around the world. It was called the Battle of Seattle. But the most significant thing was not what happened in the streets. It was what happened inside the convention center. Delegates from developing countries rebelled. They denounced that key negotiations were conducted in rooms to which only major powers were invited. That WTO rules favored rich countries. That agriculture, the sector where developing countries were most competitive, remained protected by massive subsidies in Europe and the United States. The Seattle Conference failed. No new round was launched. 2 years later, in 2001, in Doha, Qatar, far from any possibility of mass protest, the WTO managed to launch the Doha round, officially called the Development Round, because it promised to address the concerns of developing countries. That round was never completed. More than 20 years later, it remains formally open and practically dead. The main obstacle was always the same: rich countries refused to significantly reduce their agricultural subsidies. The United States and the European Union spend hundreds of billions on subsidies to their farmers, making it impossible for farmers in developing countries to compete. The contradiction was flagrant. The same countries that preached free trade in industry and services fiercely protected their agriculture. Free trade for the products they wanted to export. Protectionism for those they wanted to import. Criticism of the WTO does not come only from the streets of Seattle. It comes from serious intellectual traditions with arguments that deserve to be heard. From the left and from many developing countries, the main criticism is that WTO rules limit the policy space developing countries need to industrialize. Intellectual property rules make generic medicines more expensive. Subsidy rules prevent industrial policy. Service rules pressure the privatization of public sectors. In short, the rules favor those who are already competitive. From more liberal quarters, the criticism is that the WTO has not gone far enough. That agriculture is still distorted by subsidies. That too many countries hide behind exceptions and special treatment. That the consensus system makes progress impossible. And there is a cross-cutting criticism: the WTO was not designed for a world where China is the second largest economy on the planet. China entered the WTO in 2001 as a developing country. Today it is an industrial superpower with an economic model where the state plays a role that does not fit easily into rules designed for market economies. The WTO was a real achievement of multilateralism. But it is clear that the rules designed in the 90s are not prepared for the challenges of the 21st century. Behind acronyms like GATT and WTO, behind negotiation rounds and dispute panels, are decisions that directly affect millions of people's lives. When the WTO forces a country to lower tariffs on medicines, consumers benefit if prices fall. But if intellectual property rules prevent the manufacture of generics, the effect can be the opposite: more expensive medicines in countries where people cannot afford them. When Europe and the United States maintain massive agricultural subsidies, their farmers prosper. But the farmers of Ghana, Mali, and Burkina Faso, who produce cotton or cocoa without any subsidy, cannot compete with artificially cheapened products. The global trade system is not neutral. Its rules reflect the power relationships that existed when they were created. And changing them requires a consensus that, so far, has been impossible to achieve. 3 ideas to take away from this episode. First, GATT, created in 1947 as a provisional agreement, managed to reduce tariffs dramatically and multiply world trade by 20 in 47 years. Second, the WTO, created in 1995, expanded the rules to cover services and intellectual property and created a real dispute settlement mechanism. But the Seattle protests and the failure of the Doha round revealed deep tensions between rich and developing countries. Third, the main contradiction of the system is that countries that preach free trade often protect their own strategic sectors. European and American agricultural subsidies are the clearest example. By the 90s, the institutions were in place and the walls were falling. Globalization accelerated faster than anyone had predicted. Hundreds of millions of people were lifted out of poverty. And hundreds of millions of others saw their world change in ways they had not chosen. The world became flat. Or did it? That, next time.